Chapter 1: The Day the Sky Refused. Peace. For 211 years the conquered of Meridian had stood as the proudest proof that intelligent species could grow beyond the instincts that had once chained them to blood, conquest, and extinction. Human diplomats loved invoking it in speeches, not because the conquered was perfect, but because it represented an old dream made stubbornly real. Trade lanes shared instead of seized, border disputes arbitrated rather than bombed, famine addressed through pooled logistics, piracy contained by joint patrol fleets, and 1,000 small miracles of cooperation that history books rarely celebrated, because none of them came with glorious battle footage. Humanity had not founded the conquered alone, nor had it ever truly controlled it, but humans had become one of its loudest defenders precisely because their own early history had taught them how ruinously expensive pride could be. That was why the first reports from the Varick throne world seemed unbelievable even to those who read them with their own eyes. An imperial speech, a closed royal assembly, a declaration that all prior treaties with lesser mammalian coalition species were null, a formal accusation that human expansion had polluted the dignity of the stars. Then came the footage leaked by some panicked clerk before the palace networks shut down. The Varick king, Talvik IX, standing upon a black stone dais while rows of armored nobles struck their chest plates in approval. His crest flared wide in the ceremonial sign of domination, promising not merely sanctions or trade seizure, but a cleansing war that would restore hierarchy to galaxy degraded by human equality. Anyone who had dealt with the Varick in the past knew that arrogance was built into the architecture of their empire. They were tall-scaled, broad-shouldered creatures evolved from desert apex stock with elongated jaws, burning amber eyes, and a rigid caste tradition so old that even reformers among them struggled to imagine society without it. Their nobility considered compromise an embarrassment, and mercy weakness best outsourced to administrators. Yet even by their standards, Talvik's speech was madness. For decades the Varick had benefited from conquered markets, bought human agricultural synthesis tech during their drought years, licensed Terran med-shield patents to protect their hatchlings from bone fever plagues, and quietly accepted human anti-piracy support along the amber routes, while publicly mocking the very notion of interspecies interdependence. Many analysts therefore assumed Talvik's threats were theater for internal politics, a brutal performance meant to shore up his weakening legitimacy after 3 failed harvest cycles and a string of humiliating corruption scandals in the royal fleet. Unfortunately, men and kings who play with war to strengthen themselves often discover too late that war has appetites of its own. Talvik's did not stop at speeches. Within 9 days, Varick battle groups crossed neutral lanes and annihilated a human escorted relief convoy bound for the moons of Seraph. They did it openly, broadcasting the attack as a warning to any species misled by human softness. The convoy carried food, antibiotics, and atmospheric filters for children living beneath toxic storm domes. The Varick fleet captains did not care. By the time the transmission reached the wider net, hundreds were dead, and the conquered's old machinery of protest had already begun its familiar, useless groaning. Emergency sessions, sanctions proposals, calls for restraint from species too frightened to choose a side, and Statements from minor ambassadors who still believed paper could shame predators in the act of feeding. Humanity did what it had trained itself to do first. It tried diplomacy again. That detail mattered later because historians would spend generations arguing over whether the war could have been avoided, whether the response had been too severe, whether Talvik had ever truly intended total conflict or merely assumed humanity would bend under spectacle and terror. What no honest archive could deny was that the Terran assembly sent envoys under truce even after the convoy massacre. They transmitted evidence. They demanded restitution and surrender of the responsible admirals. They offered supervised mediation, border freezes, even face-saving language if the VAR throne would simply step back from the edge and preserve something of its dignity. Talvik answered by having the senior envoy's shuttle shot apart over his own capital while millions watched. He then announced that the burning debris falling across the upper atmosphere was human tribute. At that moment, the old arguments inside human government died. The moderates lost the room, not because they lacked reason, but because reason had finally exhausted every bridge and discovered only fire on the far side. To understand what came next, one has to understand something the VAR never truly believed about humans. They mistook human diplomacy for cowardice because their own culture could not imagine strength operating quietly for long periods without demanding applause. They saw compromise and assumed incapacity. They saw mercy and assumed softness. They saw grief over civilian casualties and concluded that humanity's emotional openness made it unfit for prolonged conflict. What they did not see or refused to see was the industrial depth beneath human restraint, the way 2 centuries of relative peace had not erased military doctrine so much as buried it under logistical civilization. Humanity had not forgotten how to wage war. It had simply preferred not to. One's preference broke what surface was not they. Hot-headed recklessness. Talvik expected but something colder and infinitely worse for his empire. Coordinated purpose, shipyards that had spent decades building exploration frigates shifted to armor plating and strike carriers in less than a month. Civilian freight algorithms were repurposed to map rapid supply webs across 11 sectors. Reserve officers who had spent their service years over seeing flood response, orbital rescue, and anti-piracy patrols were recalled into a unified theater command structure, so efficient it frightened even allied worlds. The war declaration, when it came, was only 7 lines long. No chest-beating rhetoric, no species insults, no vow of vengeance, merely the legal finding that the Viridian crown had committed mass murder, the formal suspension of all protective treaties, and a statement that the Terran coalition would remove the current Viridian regime by force and dismantle its offensive capacity to prevent further atrocities. Talvik laughed when he heard it. Palace recordings recovered later showed him mocking the merchant primates who believed mass production and sentiment could overcome warrior blood around him. His nobles laughed too, though not all of them with conviction. Some among the older warlords had actually studied human history and understood enough to be uneasy. They had seen the archival simulations of Earth's ancient industrial wars, the casualty charts, the doctrinal studies of how a species notorious for internal division could become terrifyingly unified when, convinced its moral threshold had been crossed, but Talvik had long ago surrounded himself with flatterers, hereditary fools and zealots too, intoxicated by hierarchy to admit uncertainty. He launched a second wave, before the human fleets could fully assemble, striking frontier colonies, torching orbital infrastructure, and broadcasting the executions of captured dockworkers in an attempt to make fear spread faster than retaliation. For a few terrible weeks, it seemed as though the strategy might work. Human settlements burned, refugees fled under escort, the outer systems begged for reinforcements faster than any command structure could provide them. The Varick throne interpreted this as proof of superiority. In truth, they were racing the opening moments of their own funeral. The first real counteroffensive began at Hadean Gap, a narrow lane of gravitational instability that the Varick considered impassable at scale, and therefore left underdefended except for monitoring pickets. They assumed humans would take the obvious routes, because obvious routes were honorable. Instead, Terran Command ran carrier groups through the gap under engine blackout, towing modular shield barges and using mining drones as decoy missions. When the Varick Third Spear fleet turned to answer a fake incursion near Serf, they exposed their flank to a human task force that did not bother with opening speeches. It struck command ships first, communications second, fuelers third, and escape vectors not at all. Within 11 hours, the Third Spear fleet ceased to exist as a coherent force. The humans did not chase glory footage, they severed logistics, rescued survivors where feasible, and moved on before Varick analysts could even reconstruct what had happened. Similar blows followed in brutal sequence. Orbital yards sabotaged by cyberwar cells before they could launch reserve cruisers, moon fortresses neutralized from inside by slave caste revolts, quietly coordinated through human intelligence channels. Food depots seized instead of bombs so occupied hatchling districts would not starve. When local governors fled, that last detail infuriated Talvik more than any battlefield loss he could understand. Annihilation he could not understand. An enemy who crushed fleets while simultaneously feeding the children of the empire that had just murdered theirs. By the third month of war, the Varick had stopped laughing. By the fourth, they had started lying to themselves at imperial scale. Every lost fleet became a heroic tactical withdrawal. Every shattered fortress became a planned session. Every world quietly flipping allegiance under Terran protection became proof of internal betrayal rather than public disgust. With the throne, Talvik himself grew harsher, more theatrical, more visibly unstable. He had dissidents flayed publicly, generals executed for insufficient aggression, and provincial governors replaced by young blood nobles whose only qualification was fanaticism. Yet the more he performed strength, the more brutal his empire became. Varick commoners began whispering that perhaps the humans were not invaders in the old sense at all. After all, where Terran troops advanced, they imposed curfews and disarmament, yes, but they also reopened clinics, restored water grids, and broadcast translated legal notices, explaining exactly what civilians could expect. No random purge, no ritual humiliation, no caste culling. It was infuriatingly disciplined. Talvik had wanted a war that would confirm Varick superiority Instead, every passing week exposed the cruelty of his own rule more clearly. By contrast, still he would not surrender. Men like Talvik never truly believe consequences apply to them until consequences have hands on their throat. Instead, he retreated to the throne, world fortress of Kyref Prime, and proclaimed a final holy resistance, ordering the capital turned into a citadel city while civilians were forcibly kept inside as witnesses to imperial endurance. It was then, watching the Varric king barricade himself behind the bodies of his own people, that humanity's war aim hardened. From removal to demonstration, Talvik had wanted theater. He would have it, but not the kind he imagined. Not banners, not noble last dance. What awaited him would become the image that ended an empire, a king who had wanted war, and the day humans dragged him through the ashes he himself had made. Chapter 2: The Breaking of the Spear. Empire. Kyref Prime had once been described in diplomatic literature as austere, magnificent, and mathematically cruel in its beauty. Even species who disliked the Varric admitted that the capital possessed a certain terrifying grandeur. Its palace city rose from a basin of black volcanic glass, ringed by red cliffs and defensive towers shaped like the fangs of some planetary beast. Causeways of polished obsidian linked military plazas to state archives, execution courts, noble compounds, and ceremonial arenas where generations of kings had displayed captives or trophies and conquered banners beneath the open sky. Everything about the place had been designed to instruct the viewer in the permanence of Varric hierarchy. You were meant to feel small approaching it, and if you were not Varric nobility, you were meant to feel afraid. That architecture turned against itself the moment human siege doctrine wrapped around the world. Human fleets did not immediately glass outer districts or rain indiscriminate orbital fire, because by then Terran command understood that Talvik had trapped millions of civilians in the capital precisely to provoke such a response and then mythologize it. Instead, they began the slower, more psychologically devastating work of isolation. Orbital elevators were cut, first not by bombing but by precision strikes on control relays. Communication arrays were spoofed, then captured. Noble escape craft vanished from launch pads after midnight raids by insertion. Teams whose existence Talvik publicly denied, even while screaming about them in private councils. Food silos outside the palace perimeter were seized intact and redistributed under guarded ration corridors, turning the human blockade into a daily lesson for common Varric citizens. The king starved them for theater while the enemy organized supplies. That alone did not break the empire, but it cracked something foundational. Varric society had always relied on spectacle. Nobility had to look invincible. Kings had to look ordained by history. Soldiers had to believe the violence they performed was mirrored by competence at the top. Once that illusion began to fail in public, rot spread quickly. Terran intelligence exploited it with ruthless elegance. They flooded local channels with authenticated records of Talvik's war crimes, but also with simpler, more corrosive truths. Shipment logs proving food had been stockpiled only for palace districts. Casualty reports showing noble regiments abandoned common infantry during the first outer breaches. Testimony from captured Varric officers who admitted the throne had expected only a short punitive war, not full-scale retaliation. even more humiliating were the humanitarian broadcasts, human medics speaking, careful translated Varic dialects, explained where treatment tents were located, what symbols marked neutral, safe corridors, how surrendered units would be processed, and most dangerously, of all, what rights civilian castes would retain after the fall of the regime. Talvik responded by jamming frequencies, but by then the message had escaped into rumor, into street talk, into the private calculations of clerks, laborers, and junior officers whose loyalty had always depended less on ideology than on the belief that resistance to the crown was hopeless. Now resistance had a shape, a timetable, and a growing body count that belonged not to human invaders, but to the king, who refused to end the siege. Inside the palace, matters worsened by the hour. Talvik's senior general staff had been reduced to a narrow circle of hardliners and terrified opportunists. Admiral Karis, once considered the most dangerous living Varic strategist, argued repeatedly for negotiated surrender terms while enough fleet remnants still existed to preserve some fragment of central authority. For this, Talvik stripped him of rank in full war council and had him taken away for reflection under confinement, which was palace language for torture staged as patriotic correction. Two other commanders disappeared after that, one by execution and one by suspicious self-termination in his own bunker. The younger blood lords, elevated because they fed Talvik's appetite for denial, promised miracle reversals that never came. They spoke of final offensives, while human armor divisions systematically dismantled outer defense belts, moved through industrial wards, and paused only long enough to evacuate civilians from planned combat sectors. Varic Palace chroniclers, those who survived long enough to be interrogated, later recorded that Talvik grew obsessed during this period with an ancient imperial proverb, "A king dragged is not a king at all." He repeated it in councils, in private feasts to trembling attendants, even to execution victims awaiting sentence, as if saying the line often enough might grant a protective power. History, however, possesses a cruel sense of irony. It loves nothing more than making a prophecy true by inversion. The ground assault on Care Prime began not with a glorious charge but with silence. One night the outer batteries simply stopped firing. Human cyber war teams had already turned sections of the city grid into a labyrinth of false telemetry, and when elite Veridian defenders redeployed to meet phantom armor columns in the North Ridge sector, actual Terran breacher brigades crossed the dry canal system in the south beneath portable shield canopy and aerosol smoke. They did not waste time contesting every block. They moved around fortress nodes, cut tunnels through service levels, planted relay beacons for medevac corridors, and left behind translated warnings. Palace security will abandon you. Shelter below marked blue signs. Do not carry weapons across humanitarian checkpoints. Civilians began following them, at first in frightened trickles, then in whole neighborhoods. Every family that crossed into protected sectors weakened Talvik's greatest defensive asset, the bodies he intended to sacrifice for narrative. As dawn rose over the capital's basalt towers, palace lookouts witnessed something almost unimaginable in Veridian political cosmology. Commoners moving not toward royal banners for safety, but away from them. The fiercest fighting came around The Avenue of Spears, the ceremonial route leading from the war plazas to the palace gates, Viridian Royal Guard. Units still among the most disciplined. Soldiers in the Empire, dug into tiered killing grounds designed for exactly such a final stand. They had anti-armor pits, elevated plasma nests, overlapping fire arcs, and centuries of blood mythology behind them. Human commanders studied the avenue for 6 hours, then declined to honor the script, rather than feeding troops straight into the symbolic lane. They collapsed, adjoining ministry buildings with shaped charges, drove engineering crawlers through the side districts, and forced the royal guard to fight in a broken urban maze, where ritual formation meant less than adaptability. The battle that followed was short, brutal, and devoid of pageantry. Viridian guards fought with astonishing courage. Human marines met them with equal ferocity and better coordination. By the time the smoke cleared, the Avenue of Spears stood largely intact, yet strategically irrelevant, a monument to Talbot belief that enemies would obey the emotional logic of his architecture. They had not. They had simply gone around it and turned the palace flank. All through this, Terran command transmitted the same offer every 4 hours: surrender the king, disarm remaining palace units, release all civilian hostages, and the bombardment codes already keyed against the royal compound would remain in use. Talbot answered each time by broadcasting himself from the throne hall, plated in ceremonial war armor, swearing that he would rather drown the city in blood than kneel before prey. Species. It was one of those speeches intended to sound immortal, and instead reeked of panic. His faceplate failed to conceal the tremor in his jaw. His crest flared unevenly. Behind him, even his own nobles looked like hostages to his delusion. Across occupied sectors, people watched and began making decisions. Garrison commanders surrendered independent of the throne. Dock masters sabotaged palace resupply attempts. Slave caste labor gangs cut power to execution yards. A rebellion of maintenance crews opened a service gate beneath the archive district, allowing Terran units direct access to the inner ring. No empire falls from the top alone. It collapses when ordinary people decide the myth has become too expensive to keep carrying. By the 7th day of the capital assault, the palace city had shrunk to a few burning districts and a central fortress complex. Human drones filled the skies in layered grids, some armed, many merely observing, recording, broadcasting. That last detail mattered profoundly. Tyrant leadership had concluded early that Talvik's final defeat had to be seen not by way of revenge spectacle, but as undeniable evidence that no king, no matter how theatrical his cruelty, could hide behind titles. Once the machinery of domination failed, the Varick Empire had spent centuries teaching its subjects that rulers were above humiliation and beyond accountability. Humans intended to destroy that idea as thoroughly as they destroyed the war machine, not through massacre, through exposure, through legal capture, through the sight of power stripped to flesh, fear, and consequence. The breach into the palace happened at dusk beneath a storm of black ash from burning fuel depots. Beyond the western terraces, the throne fortress had internal blast doors, kill box corridors, and shielded sanctum chambers modeled after old bunker palaces from the dynasty wars. None of that saved it. Human assault teams entered through 3 vectors at once. 1 through the shattered archive. Vaults 1 via vertical insertion down. The ventilation crown after sapper. Drones burned the grates and won most. Humiliatingly, of all through the royal procession hall after palace servants. Loyal only to survival unlocked the lower seals, fighting turned savage. The corridors, Talvek's remaining. Loyalists died hard. Human units, already exhausted by the siege, moved. Like people too disciplined to hate. Sloppily, room by room, stair by stair. They narrowed the palace until the king's world consisted of a single ceremonial suite and the corridor. Outside it, there amid toppled standards and the bodies of his final guard, Talvek IX discovered what every tyrant eventually learns too late. That titles cannot physically restrain the hands reaching for you when the door to the war chamber finally blew. Inward, Talvek did not die in majesty. He fired wildly. He screamed old lineage. Names as if ancestry were a weapon. He struck one marine with a blade before being tackled beneath his own map table. 3 soldiers went down on him at once. Locking arms, spine, jaw. The king who had promised to reduce human worlds to smoke had to be shot twice before his claws unclenched from the broken hilt. Outside, through the breached windows, care of Prime burned under the red-black dusk. The palace intercoms were dead. The throne hall was gone. The empire had already effectively ended, yet what happened next would matter more than the capture itself. Human field command, with cameras rolling and med teams already moving civilians through the lower gates, issued an order no Varak subject could have imagined hearing in their own lifetime. The king was to be taken alive, publicly processed, and marched out through the capital. He had doomed, not hidden, not executed in a bunker, not spared the sight of his own collapse, dragged if necessary through the ashes. Chapter 3. The King in the dust. Talvek began spitting commands. The moment the shock restraints bit into his wrists, even pinned to the floor. Beneath half-broken ceremonial furniture, armor cracked, crest matted with soot, he still spoke in the voice of someone who believed obedience should exist merely because he existed. He ordered the humans to release him in the name of ancient succession law. He invoked the sanctity of royal blood. He promised sectors, ports, resources, hostages, secret caches of antimatter, reserves, anything that might reframe the moment as negotiation instead of consequence. When that failed, he shifted to insult, then to prophecy, then to the old imperial certainty that the universe itself would punish those who laid hands upon a crowned Varak king. The Marines binding him did not bother answering. They had just spent a week clearing streets where his artillery had turned schools and ration lines into blackened rubble. One of them, a medic sergeant from Nairobi sector whose brother had died on the relief convoy over Sarif, later testified that the hardest part was not striking Talvek, but not striking him. Discipline held because discipline was the point. This was no assassination. Rage, no battlefield lynching. Humanity wanted the king visible, breathing, terrified and unmistakably mortal. They hauled him upright anyway because he refused to stand. That refusal, trivial as it sounds, became the symbolic hinge on which the whole moment turned. For all Talvek's roaring about invincible kingship, his body knew before his mouth did that the old magic was gone. He twisted, clawed, and tried to plant his feet against the polished stone of the War chamber but 3 humans in combat. Harness simply dragged him forward while cut away his ceremonial cape so it would not snag on debris outside the chamber. Doors, shattered palace corridors opened like a wound through the heart of Varric. Grandeur, walls that had once displayed conquest mosaics were scorched black. Noble banners lay trampled in ash and broken glass. Emergency lights flashed, red over smoke-choked vaulting. Somewhere below, civilians shouted directions in a mix of fear and stunned disbelief as humanitarian teams guided them toward cleared exits. Talvik saw all this and finally stopped trying to bargain. Instead, for a few long seconds he stared with the empty incomprehension of a man watching theology fail in real time. He had built his entire identity on the assumption that the crown transformed the bearer into a category above ordinary degradation. Now human hands were on his arms, his shoulders, his throat, restrained, and none of the stars had split open to save him. The march outward was deliberate. Terran command rejected several faster extraction routes because speed would have diluted meaning. They wanted every surviving loyalist, every liberated civilian, every hidden camera and drone relay in the capital to witness the fall of imperial inviolability. So the soldiers took Talvik the long way from the war chamber, through the procession gallery, down the obsidian stair of tribute, across the fractured hall of lineages, and into the open-air imperial forecourt, where generations of conquered peoples had once been made to kneel before the throne. There was no kneeling now. There was dust, heat, broken statuary, and a sky crowded with drones humming like mechanical hornets. Human combat cams streamed the scene, lived through dozens of languages, while legal officers narrated chain of custody procedures into official records so no one could later claim the footage was fabricated. Every detail was documented: time of capture, injuries observed, restraint, protocol, confirmation of identity by biometric scan, refusal of surrender, codes, notice of war crimes, detention. It was ruthless precisely because it was orderly. No mob frenzy, no secret dungeon, only the merciless destruction of myth by procedure and public fact. Talvik hated that most of all, even then, with wrists locked behind him and one leg partially dragging from the stun strike. He could have endured a theatrical beating better than this cold conversion from sovereign to detainee. He roared at the cameras, demanding they stop transmitting. He tried to recite coronation rites, but ash choked the words when one Marine forced him forward after he deliberately collapsed. At the top of the stair, the king's body slid across its slick stone, leaving a dark streak through the burned remnants of his own ceremonial markings. The image went everywhere within minutes. The Varric king, hauled by the restraint chain across the debris of his palace, while the empire watched. Some human commentators, less disciplined than their commanders, called it justice in its purest form. Others called it necessary humiliation. Among liberated Varric civilians, the reaction was more complex. Many were stunned into silence. Some wept, not for Talvik himself, but for the end of a cosmology. A few, especially those from labor castes and occupied provinces, began openly cheering once the disbelief passed. That too was captured, the sound of common Varric voices shouting at their own king as he was dragged into daylight, had greater empire-destroying power than any orbital strike could ever possess. When Talvik reached the imperial Forecourt the humans paused just long, enough to force him to his feet between two cracked statues of long dead conquerors. The square beyond had become a basin of ash and rubble, burned troop carriers smoldered near the fountain of submission whose water lines had ruptured and turned the lower steps into black mud. The banners of House Talvik had fallen from their poles and tangled in the wreckage. Above it all, on the giant facade of the palace broadcast tower, someone, likely a palace tech who had finally chosen a side, had overridden the royal crest with a plain translated message visible even through smoke. The war is over. The king is in custody. Civilians proceed to blue corridors. Talvik saw it. Every witness saw him see it. Something feral moved through his face then, not dignity, not rage alone, but the panic of a creature realizing that narrative had escaped him forever. He lunged at one of the Marines with enough violence that the chain snapped taut and dropped him hard to one knee in the ash. There he stayed, coughing black dust while the cameras drank in every second. Yet Terran command still was not finished. The order had specified the capital, not just the palace. Talvik had made war a spectacle. Now he would be made a pass through the city. He had refused to spare. An armored convoy assembled around the procession. Medics, legal officers, Marines, drone screens, and supply teams still escorting civilians in the opposite direction. It would have been easier to sedate the king, easier to throw him into a secure transport, easier perhaps for some of the soldiers emotionally. Instead, they kept him conscious and moving. Where the rubble was thick, he was dragged. Where the streets were passable, he was forced to walk under restraint. He stumbled through the avenue of spears, no longer protected by royal guard phalanxes, but hemmed in by the same black columns and plazas that had once magnified his majesty. He crossed the market tier, where his artillery had collapsed food halls to block civilian flight. He passed the breached infirmary district, where human field surgeons now treated wounded Varric children under conquered emergency flags. Every few hundred meters, Terran officers stopped to read legal charges aloud in translation for the record: mass murder of non-combatants, unlawful execution of diplomatic envoys, use of civilians as shield, starvation as siege policy, torture, black site administration, and aggressive war beyond treaty bounds. The repetition was intentional. Talvik had ruled by decree. Now decree came for him. Not every human approved of keeping him alive. That tension mattered and was visible. Along the convoy route, Marines stared at him with murder in their faces. Some had lost family on Seraph. Others had spent weeks lifting burned civilians from structures his commanders had shelled. A drone recording from the lower terrace caught a corporal muttering that a bullet would be kinder than the march. The captain beside him answered, "Kindness is not the metric." That sentence became famous later because it explained the philosophy of the whole act. Execution would have ended Talvik quickly and turned him, in time, into a martyr for those hungry to mythologize defeat. This public ruin did the opposite. It made him small. It made him accountable. It showed his own people in real streets under real ash. That kingship was not armor against law. The humans were not merely defeating an enemy. They were dismantling the emotional infrastructure that had made his empire possible. By the time they reached the outer civic bowl, crowds had begun to gather despite ongoing Evacuation orders, some came because they did not believe the reports, some came because they needed to see with their own eyes that the impossible had happened, some came because hatred or grief or curiosity pulled them into the streets against common sense. The soldiers did not encourage the crowd, but neither did they hide Talvik from it. People saw the chain, they saw the burns on his armor, they saw the dried blood and ash on his jaw, the broken dignity of a creature who had once stood above them by decree and now could not prevent himself from being hauled forward when his legs buckled. Then, from somewhere high in the bowl, an old, Varick female voice rang out in the public dialect, "Where is your hierarchy?" Now the square went deathly still. Talvik turned toward the sound with naked hatred. Another voice answered from the crowd below, then another, until the basin filled with questions. No one would have dared speak a week earlier. Where were the fleets he promised? Where was the food he hid? Where were the sons he sacrificed? Where was the greatness that needed children burned to prove itself? By the time the convoy resumed, Talvik was no longer being dragged only through ashes. He was being dragged through the collapse of belief. Chapter 4: The End of the Throne. Species. The holding platform prepared for Talvik's transfer lay outside the southern gate of the capital on ground once reserved for military parades and victorious review marches. It was a bitterly appropriate location. Here, under ordinary imperial custom, conquered leaders have been paraded in chains before execution or permanent degradation. Here Varick kings had received tribute from kneeling client species while war drums rolled and aerial formations painted the sky with blood-red banners. Now the parade ground had been converted into a field command tribunal encircled by mobile shield towers, triage tents, press drones, and temporary processing stations where surrendered units stacked weapons under Terran supervision. The smell of smoke still hung thick over everything, but beneath it came newer smells too sterile. Field disinfectant, ration broth, wet soil from emergency water lines, the ordinary scent of a city trying to remain inhabited while history split open around it. Talvik was brought across the final stretch at twilight. His steps had long since lost coherence. The humans holding his chain no longer looked triumphant, only resolved. They were tired beyond theatrics. That, too, stripped the scene of any glamour. The fall of the Varick king did not resemble poetry, it resembled labor. A temperate dais had been erected at one end of the field, not elevated like a throne, but flat and utilitarian, equipped with recording arrays and multilingual projection screens. Their Terran legal officers, conquered observers, and representatives from liberated Varick provinces waited in full view of both soldiers and civilians. Humanity could have made the tribunal exclusively its own spectacle. Instead, in another move, Talvik never would understood. They insisted witnesses from his own empire stand beside them, not blood nobles. Those had either fled, died, been detained by governors from occupied provinces, labor caste council delegates, med shield administrators, and archive custodians whose families had lived under royal extraction for generations. Their presence transformed the proceeding from simple victors' justice into something more destabilizing, a record that the empire had not only been defeated from outside, but repudiated from within. When Talvik was forced to stand before them, his Gaze moved from face to face with growing horror. He had spent his reign treating those categories of people as infrastructure, not political beings. Now they had become witnesses to his unmaking. The charges were read in full, not the short battlefield list repeated during the march, but the complete indictment assembled from seized archives, convoy recordings, palace orders, fleet logs, and survivor testimony. The language was clinical, almost dry, and therefore devastating. Every atrocity was dated, every command chain noted, every instance in which Tao Vec personally authorized starvation. Policy, execution theater, black side. Expansion, diplomatic murder, or retaliatory civilian bombardment was placed into sequence and cross-referenced against recovered signature screens behind the dais displayed evidence as the reading continued. The destroyed relief convoy over Seraph intercepted orders denying evacuation from the capital's lower hatchling wards, transport manifests marking prisoners not by names but experimental utility classes, palace budget reallocations preserving royal wine cellars while urban ration reserves collapsed. The recording of Talvec mocking the burning human envoy shuttle over his own city. The crowd watching. The tribunal changed as the reading continued. Human soldiers grew quieter. Varick civilians went from stunned to visibly sick, then to hard-eyed fury. Some among the surrendered royal guard lowered their heads and never raised them again. Talvec tried at first to interrupt, then to dismiss, then to ridicule the process as premorality. Each time he spoke, the evidence resumed over him, swallowing his voice with fact. When invited to answer the charges, Talvec did what tyrants so often do when stripped of control. He revealed his worldview with more clarity than he ever had in triumph. He did not deny the convoy massacre. He justified it as hierarchy. He did not deny the use of civilians as shields. He called it necessary spectacle. He did not deny the black sites. He argued that fear was civilization's spine. He insisted even then that species needed rank, that compassion poisoned strength, that humans had corrupted the stars by teaching lesser beings to imagine dignity without domination. The more he spoke, the more any remaining aura of majesty curdled into something smaller and uglier. He was not a dragon king defending some tragic imperial order. He was a frightened sadist with a throne. By the time he finished, even some former loyalists looked at him as though seeing the core of the empire for the first time. It was not destiny, it was appetite dressed in ceremonial metal. Then came the moment historians later identified as the true death of the Varick monarchy, not the capture, not the march, not even the indictment. A labor caste representative named Irish, an elderly Varick female whose sons had died repairing war foundries they were forbidden to refuse, stepped forward to address the tribunal. She did not bow. That alone would once have been unthinkable. In a voice cracked by age and ash but amplified across the field, she said, "All my life we were told the crown carried the weight of the species. We bent so it could stand tall. We starved so it could look eternal. We buried children and called it order. Today I see only a creature who fed on us and named it glory." Then she turned, not to the human officers, but to the crowd of Varick civilians, and surrendered troops beyond the barrier. "If there is shame here," she said, "let it end with him. If there is a future, it begins when no one is dragged in chains ever. Again for the vanity of one bloodline. The field went silent, then slowly as if a species were relearning its own. Spine vertebra by vertebra, Varric. Civilians began lowering themselves not in prostration to a king, but to collect handfuls of ash from the ruined parade, ground and cast it at the base of the tribunal dais where Talvik stood in. Restraints not at the humans at him. Funeral gesture turned into condemnation. Terran command could have executed him that night. Many expected it, some demanded it, but again humanity chose the harsher long logic. Talvik was remanded not to immediate death but to indefinite interstellar war crimes detention under conquered emergency authority with full public record preserved and testimony to continue for years if necessary. He would live long enough to hear every sector he had terrorized speak over him. He would watch the empire he had tried to preserve dismantled into accountable provinces and reconstruction councils. He would never regain narrative control, never die on a battlefield, never become a clean martyr for revanchist mythmakers. That decision infuriated extremists on all sides, yet it proved strategically brilliant. Deprived of glorious death, Talvik became what he had most feared becoming, an object lesson. Children on liberated worlds learned his name not as conqueror but as warning. Varric schools, once restructured, taught the footage of his march through care of Prime as the day hierarchy met consequence. Human academies studied the campaign under a colder title, Operation Ash Crown. Popular memory, of course, preferred the sharper phrasing the day aliens wanted war until humans ruthlessly dragged their king through the ashes. In the months that followed, the aftermath proved more complicated than victory. Songs aloud, human casualty lists remained horrific. Entire frontier settlements had been lost in the opening attacks. Varric provinces fractured under the weight of old caste resentments and new power vacuums. Reconstruction required patience far less glamorous than orbital battles. Terran troops found themselves policing revenge killings, escorting food convoys to regions that had once cheered Talvik's speeches, and mediating disputes among species whose hatred had outlived the king by generations. There were human officers who privately wondered whether the empire had been too damaged to salvage, whether perhaps annihilation would have been simpler. Yet simplicity was never the point. Talvik had believed war existed to restore hierarchy. Humanity had answered by proving the opposite. That war, once forced upon them, would be used not just to defeat an aggressor, but to strip his system of the myths that made aggression sacred. Dragging of the king was not celebrated because it was cruel in itself. It was remembered because it ended something older than one man. It showed that titles, bloodlines, and species arrogance could all be hauled bodily into the open and judged by the worlds they had tried to dominate. Years later, when Care of Prime's civic bowl had been rebuilt into a memorial forum lined with both human and Varric names, visitors could still see a preserved strip of blackened stone from the old southern gate road. The plaque beside it did not glorify the march. It did not speak of vengeance. It read, "Here ended the law. That power makes a creature untouchable. Here began the work of making sure no throne ever again stands above law." Those who wanted a cleaner story, heroes triumphant, villains dead, justice neat, often found the inscription unsatisfying. history rarely satisfies those who hunger for simplicity, but for the survivors who remembered the convoy. Over Sarif, the burning envoy shuttle, the hungry hatchlings trapped in a king's capital, and the sound of common Varric voices rising as Talvik was dragged through his own ashes. The truth was enough. The aliens had wanted war. The humans had answered, and in the end, what shattered the empire was not merely firepower but the ruthless refusal to let a king remain a king once he had made himself a monster.